We were halfway through dinner when my father set his fork down, leaned back in his chair, and said it like a fact, not an insult. "She's a burden. Always has been. Only good at making mistakes." His voice didn't rise. He didn't look angry. Just tired, like he'd waited years to say it out loud. Across the table, my mother folded her napkin in her lap. She didn't even look at me when she added, "And her kid? He's just a mini failure. Runs in the family, I guess." The room was quiet. The only sound was the clink of silverware on porcelain. My chest felt tight, but I stayed still. I didn't defend myself. I didn't speak. Not because I agreed with them, but because it wasn't the first time. I'd heard worse. I glanced at my 7-year-old son, Leo. He was sitting beside me, legs swinging beneath the chair, a piece of chicken half chewed on his plate. His shoulders had tensed. He looked down. His eyes didn't move. Then slowly, Leo put his fork down. He didn't ask if he could be excused. He didn't look to me for reassurance. He turned his head toward my father, his grandfather, and spoke so clearly, I remember the way the room seemed to shrink around his words. "Grandpa," he said, "I read the letter you hid in Mom's old diary." My father didn't blink. My mother's hand froze in midair. I felt my heart stop. Leo kept going. "You said you never wanted her to keep me, that you told her to leave me behind." And just like that, my father never spoke again. Not to Leo, not to me, not to anyone. I didn't want to go to the dinner. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror that afternoon, brushing my hair with one hand and holding Leo's lunchbox in the other. He sat on the floor by the tub, trying to wrestle a sock onto his foot. "Do I have to call Grandpa, sir, again?" he asked without looking up. I smiled, but it didn't reach my eyes. "Only if you want to confuse him." The truth was, I hadn't seen my parents in almost 5 months. They hadn't visited, they hadn't called, and I hadn't wanted them to. But 2 weeks ago, my mom left a voicemail saying they were hosting a family dinner and that it would mean a lot if Leo and I came. She said it like she was offering us something generous, like she hadn't once told me I was a disgrace. I didn't want to go, but Leo asked if there would be dessert, so I said yes. I packed him into the car, dressed in his best corduroy pants and a tiny navy sweater. I wore a black blouse that still had a price tag tucked under the seam because I'd never had a reason to wear it before. I told myself it was just dinner, one night, a few hours. I could survive anything for Leo. As I drove through our neighborhood, Leo looked out the window and started listing dinosaurs in alphabetical order. He was proud he'd memorized that from a book his teacher gave him. I half listened, nodding, answering his quiz questions while gripping the steering wheel tighter than I needed to. By the time we reached my parents' house, the same one I grew up in, I could feel that old, heavy ache settle into my chest. The front yard was manicured to perfection. The porch was swept clean. Every window glared with polished glass. Inside, nothing had changed. My father still kept his military plaques in a neat line above the fireplace. My mother's china cabinet still had its corners dusted weekly. The living room smelled like lemon polish and something sharp underneath, something colder. Walter and Meryl weren't bad people, not in the way you hear on the news. They never hit me. They never screamed. But they had a way of breaking things without raising their voices. They chipped away at me slowly, with disapproval served in teaspoons. When I got pregnant at 28, after a messy breakup with a man who didn't want the word dad attached to his name, my parents told me I was reckless, irresponsible, ungrateful. "You already disappoint us enough," my father said. My mother added, "You think this baby's going to fix you?" But Leo was never meant to fix me. He was the only thing that ever made sense. When I looked at him for the first time, I knew I didn't need their permission to feel proud of who I was. But being a single mom wasn't easy, and sometimes, even when I was holding it together, I still heard their voices in my head. We entered the dining room with the good plates. My father stood at the head of the table like a man preparing to give orders. His smile was thin. My mother hugged me with the stiffness of a polite neighbor. Leo climbed into his chair. I helped him tuck his napkin into his lap. He looked so small at that big table, surrounded by a family that had never made room for either of us. Dinner started off polite. My parents asked about my job at the clinic, more like checked off a box. My mom complimented Leo's posture. My dad asked him if he played sports. When Leo said he liked drawing more, my father made a small grunt and said, "That's interesting." I focused on breathing evenly. I cut Leo's chicken. I reminded him to say thank you. I answered questions in short, safe sentences. But beneath the surface, I could feel it coming. The shift. That moment when civility curdles into contempt. It always came eventually. And when it did, I would be ready. Or at least I thought I would. Because no matter how many times they made me feel like I was failing, I had never let them touch Leo. I had protected him from all of it. Until that night. Until the moment my father opened his mouth and said what he really thought of me. Until my mother joined in like she'd been waiting for an invitation. And until Leo, my quiet, thoughtful little boy, put down his fork and said the one thing that none of us were ready to hear. Dinner was beef roast, green beans with almonds, and mashed potatoes piped onto the plates like it was a holiday. My mother had folded the napkins into stiff triangles. The table sparkled. It was all for show. Walter sat at the head, carving the meat with slow precision. He passed the slices out like communion. When he spoke, he didn't look at me. He looked past me, through me. "So, still working that little job at the clinic?" I nodded. "Yes. I'm a patient coordinator now." He raised an eyebrow. "Meaning you answer phones in scrubs." Before I could reply, Meryl jumped in. Celine's always had a way with words, just not with direction. Leo pushed a bean across his plate. I reached under the table and squeezed his knee gently. He didn't look up. "I like my job," I said, keeping my tone even. "I help people every day." My father chuckled softly. "Right. Saving the world one clipboard at a time?" It had always been like this, their sarcasm dressed as conversation, a casual dismantling of anything I built for myself. At 15, they told me I was too dramatic. At 20, they told me I lacked drive. At 28, when I told them I was pregnant and keeping the baby, they said I had finally ruined my life for good. Now I could feel the old rhythm returning, the double-edged compliments, the long pauses where I was supposed to feel grateful for their judgment. Meryl turned to Leo. "Do you like school, sweetie?" Leo nodded. "I like art best." She tilted her head. "No sports?" "I like drawing superheroes," he said. Walter reached for his wine. "Figures. The artsy types are always the ones who can't handle real work." The words landed with a thud. I tried to smile for Leo's sake, but something in him had changed. He was quiet now, tense. Walter sliced another piece of roast. "I just think boys should be pushed more. Celine always needed a shove." Meryl didn't disagree. She was always sensitive. We hoped motherhood might toughen her up. There was no yelling, no shouting, just knives disguised as conversation. Then it happened. Walter set his fork down, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and looked straight at me for the first time that night. "She's a burden," he said, "always has been, only good at making mistakes." His voice was calm. His words were deliberate. He wasn't angry. He was certain. I stared at him, not blinking. I didn't say anything. My chest burned, but my hands stayed still in my lap. Meryl folded her napkin again like it was the most important thing in the room. "And her kid?" she said, not even glancing at Leo. "He's just a mini-failure. Runs in the family, I guess." I looked at Leo. His face didn't change. His eyes stayed on his plate, but his fork lowered. He placed it gently beside his dish and turned to my father. "Grandpa," he said, his voice steady, "I read the letter you hid in Mom's old diary." The room froze. Meryl's head turned. Walter blinked once, then didn't move. Leo looked directly at him. "You said you never wanted her to keep me, that she should have just left me behind." My stomach dropped. I didn't understand what he was saying. I had forgotten about the old diary, shoved in a box in the attic, untouched since before Leo was born. "What letter?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Leo didn't look at me. His eyes stayed locked on his grandfather. "It was behind the back cover," he said. "You wrote that you told Mom she'd ruin her life if she had me, that you didn't want to be part of it. You said you hoped she'd disappear." Walter didn't answer. He didn't ask what Leo was talking about. He didn't deny a word of it. He sat there, mouth slightly open, completely still. My mother dropped her napkin. Her hands trembled as she tried to pick it up. No one said a word. The roast cooled on the plates, the candles kept burning, and the silence settled in like dust. For the first time in my life, I saw it. The fear behind Walter's eyes, the shame, the silence he couldn't climb out of, and my son, only 7 years old, had been the one to break the spell. I stared at my son, heart pounding, my mind racing to catch up with his words. The letter, the diary. I hadn't thought about it in years. It had been mine when I was younger, lined pages full of scrawled anger and dreams I never spoke aloud. After Leo was born, I boxed it away. I didn't remember ever finding a letter inside, and certainly not one from my father. But Leo had found it, and he had read it. Walter sat motionless. His hand hovered over his wine glass but didn't move. He looked like someone had pulled the world out from under him. "What letter?" I asked again, this time to no one in particular. Leo turned toward me now, hesitant but clear. "Last week, I was looking for the flashlight in the attic. I found your diary in a box. It had your name on the front." I nodded slowly. "Okay?" There was an envelope stuck behind the back cover. It had Grandpa's name on it. I opened it. I thought it was old and maybe important. My mother leaned forward, her voice small and sharp. "That's not his letter. He never—" Leo didn't flinch. He looked at her directly. "It had his handwriting, the same as the birthday card from last year." Walter didn't correct him. Meryl's mouth opened to protest, but nothing came out. Leo continued. "It said he told you not to keep me, that he said you'd ruin your life, that he wanted you to leave me behind." My whole body went cold. Something inside me cracked, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't grief or embarrassment, it was clarity, like finally seeing a storm from the outside instead of standing in the middle of it. "I didn't know," I said quietly, looking at my father. "I never saw that letter." Walter's lips parted slightly. He looked like he wanted to speak, but he didn't. And I realized in that moment that he wasn't just shocked he'd been exposed. He was stunned that a child had taken away his power. Leo turned to me again. "I didn't mean to get anyone in trouble." I reached out and took his hand. "You didn't. You told the truth." My mother cleared her throat. "We were trying to help you back then. You were making reckless decisions. We didn't know what else to do." I turned to her, calm but unwavering. "Trying to control someone isn't help. Telling your daughter she's a mistake and her child is a failure isn't love. It's cruelty dressed as concern." Walter still hadn't spoken. He sat there as if every word Leo had said had cemented him in place. Leo looked up at me, eyes wide. "Did you keep me even when Grandpa told you not to?" I smiled, and this time it was real. "Yes," without a second thought. He nodded slowly as if fitting the last piece of a puzzle into place, and that's when I knew what had to happen next. I stood. I lifted my napkin off my lap and placed it gently on the table. I looked across the room at the family I had tried so hard to make peace with. "To both of you," I said, "thank you for the dinner. But we won't be coming back." Meryl's jaw tightened. "Celine, be reasonable." "For 7 years," I replied, "I've been reasonable. I've explained. I've forgiven. I've let my son believe this was a safe place. But I won't sit here and let him think this kind of silence is normal." Walter finally moved. He blinked once, eyes on me, but still said nothing. Leo stood beside me. He reached for my hand. We walked to the front door without another word. I opened it, held it for Leo, and we stepped out into the night. The air was cool and quiet. As we reached the car, Leo looked up. "Are you mad at me for reading it?" "No," I said, buckling him in. "I'm proud of you for telling the truth." He nodded, then looked out the window. "Grandpa didn't say anything." "No," I said, starting the engine. "He didn't." And deep down, I knew he wouldn't. Not now. Not ever again. Because when the truth comes from the person you underestimated most, there's nowhere left to hide. The drive home was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that used to follow family dinners. It wasn't heavy or cold. It was peaceful. Leo stared out the window as streetlights passed over his face like soft spotlights. He looked thoughtful, but not afraid. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, half expecting tears, but he was calm. His small shoulders weren't tense anymore. I wasn't used to that. Back at the apartment, I tucked him into bed like always. He asked for 2 stories instead of 1. I read both, then kissed his forehead and turned out the light. As I stood to leave, he whispered, "He never said sorry." I turned back toward him. "I don't think he knows how." "Why not?" he asked. I sat on the edge of his bed. Some people spend their whole lives pretending they don't make mistakes. Saying sorry would mean they'd have to admit they were wrong. That's scary for some people. Leo thought about that for a while. Then he nodded and pulled the blanket up under his chin. "He looked scared tonight," he said. He was right. Walter hadn't shouted. He hadn't denied anything. He hadn't thrown his usual insults or tried to deflect. He had gone completely still, like a man stripped of every mask he'd ever worn. He looked like someone who had built his entire identity around being right and suddenly had no idea who he was when the truth stood in front of him. That night, after Leo fell asleep, I went to the attic. I found the box exactly where he said. The diary was wrapped in an old scarf from my college days. When I opened it, there it was, wedged in the back cover. A yellowed envelope with Walter's name written in blocky handwriting. I pulled out the paper. It was short, 1 paragraph, not signed. "If she goes through with this, she'll ruin everything. We gave her chances. She kept failing. This baby will be her final mistake. I can't stop her, but I won't support it. I won't be part of that life." I stared at the page for a long time. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It felt more like proof of something I had always sensed, but never had the words for. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. Then I lit a match in the kitchen sink and watched the paper turn to ash. I wasn't keeping it as a reminder. I didn't need it anymore. 2 weeks passed before I got a letter in the mail. It wasn't from Walter. It was from my mother. A single sheet of paper, handwritten. "You embarrassed your father. You shouldn't have let Leo read that. Children should not be involved in adult matters. This is exactly what we meant when we said you weren't fit to raise a child. We will not be reaching out again." I read it once and set it down. I didn't cry. I didn't feel rejected. I felt free. The next morning, Leo came into the kitchen while I was pouring coffee. "Do we have to see them again?" "No," I said. "We don't." He nodded. "Good, they weren't nice." He pulled a sheet of paper from his backpack. It was a drawing, a superhero in a red cape with a heart on his chest, holding the hand of a woman with curly hair and a big smile. I smiled. "Who's that?" "It's me," he said. "And you. I made you strong. You broke the dragon's fire." I hung the drawing on the fridge. Walter never called. Not once. And he never answered the message I sent to confirm we wouldn't be attending another dinner. He didn't speak to us again. But I realized something important. He didn't need to. That silence he chose, it was his own punishment. Not because I needed him to feel guilty, but because he had to finally sit with the truth. The kind that couldn't be dismissed with a sarcastic remark or silenced with judgment. Leo spoke it, and once he did, everything changed. Not just for Walter, for me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. And that was the most powerful silence of all. 1 year later, our lives looked different. Not because something dramatic had happened, but because of everything that didn't. There were no more invitations, no more phone calls, no birthday cards slipped into envelopes with clipped, impersonal notes. My parents had cut us off, but this time, it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like peace. Leo and I had moved across town to a smaller, brighter apartment closer to his school. The windows overlooked a park where he rode his scooter after class. On Saturdays, he helped me pick out fruit at the farmer's market. Our life was quiet but full. I'd started working full-time at the clinic. They promoted me after I helped coordinate a patient resource program that cut wait times in half. I never told my parents. I didn't need to. I stopped measuring my worth in things they would never see. Oh, one afternoon, I picked Leo up from school. His teacher, Miss Everett, stopped me outside the classroom. "I wanted to tell you," she said. "Leo wrote an essay about his hero. He picked you." I stood there, stunned. "Really?" She smiled. "He wrote that you're brave, and that sometimes being brave means saying nothing when people expect you to fight, that you taught him how to be kind and strong without becoming mean." I thanked her and walked Leo to the car. He hummed as we drove. "I didn't bring up the essay. I didn't need to. He had said it all in the way he leaned back in the seat with contentment, like home was wherever we were together. Later that evening, he sat at the kitchen table drawing again. This time, it was a comic strip. I looked over his shoulder. A small boy with a paper sword stood between his mom and a dragon. The dragon breathed fire made of words. Burden. Mistake. Failure. But the boy wasn't afraid. He held up a mirror and the dragon stopped breathing fire. Why a mirror? I asked. Leo shrugged. Because sometimes people say mean things to hide from themselves. But if they have to look at what they really said, they can't hide anymore. I leaned down and kissed the top of his head. He went back to drawing and I stood in the kitchen, staring at the little red heart he had drawn on the mom's shirt. That was when it truly landed. I had spent so many years trying to earn love from people who only understood control. I bent to fit their expectations. I shrank to stay in their orbit. I took their silence as a judgment instead of the gift it could become. But now I knew better. Walter's silence wasn't power. It was emptiness. He had nothing left to say, not because he had won, but because he finally saw the cost of the words he had chosen over decades. The man who once controlled every room with a glance had been undone by a child who simply spoke the truth. And that child, my son, was growing into someone who would never need to shout to be heard. Sometimes I wondered if Walter ever thought about what happened that night, if he remembered Leo's voice, if he regretted the letter or the silence that followed. I would never know. And that was the point. I no longer needed answers. I no longer waited for closure. I had created my own. The day after Leo's birthday, we planted a tree in the yard behind our building. It was his idea. Trees don't talk, he said, but they grow. As we packed the soil around the roots, I asked what kind of tree he wanted it to be. A truth tree, he said, so it always stands tall even when people say the wrong things. That evening, I looked at the tree from the kitchen window. It was small, barely taller than Leo, but sturdy. The wind moved its leaves, but it held firm. That's what we were now. Not loud, not flashy, but rooted in something real. The night Walter called me a burden, I had stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, but because I knew my worth didn't depend on his words. Leo showed me that the truth doesn't always need to roar. Sometimes it just needs to be said once, clearly in the presence of someone who needed to hear it. And when it is, everything changes. We don't speak to my father anymore. But that silence is finally mine. Some stories aren't about revenge or redemption. Some are about reclaiming the parts of ourselves that were never broken to begin with. I used to think silence meant weakness, that staying quiet made me small. But I understand now that silence, when chosen on your own terms, is a kind of strength. My father never spoke again, and I never needed him to. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to stand in the quiet and choose yourself anyway, like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. Your story matters too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more true stories that speak the truth we sometimes struggle to say out loud. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.